Perhaps the most difficult skill to understand in Pokemon Sleep is Tasty Chance S, which is currently dominated by Dedenne. So I thought long and hard about this, and I finally came down to a much more simple way of thinking about Dedenne and how it applies strength to your dishes or your week. And that's these tables here. Now I know that looks scary, and that's because it is, but I will break it down in the rest of this video, how I got to these numbers, and how to use these tables. Even though this is still complex to understand, it is the most simple way we can go about understanding Dedenne. If you've seen my first video explaining Dedenne's Tasty Chance S, you'll remember these branches, and I said that it was pretty much impossible for me to physically calculate how much value Dedenne gives. If you haven't seen it, you don't need to watch it to understand this video, but I do highly recommend it because it explains why it's so complex. Even the math geniuses in the Pokemon Sleep math code had to rely on computer simulations, in other words Monte Carlo simulations, in order to give you some sort of resemblance of value in Dedenne. But in reality, we have both failed you up to this point, because what does it mean to have 6 triggers per day and then level 6 Tasty Chance S to give you a total weekly value of ingredients of 33% boost? What if you don't use Dedenne throughout the week? What if you only use it for half the week? This entire table completely changes. It's not like you can just deduce the number by halving it if you use Dedenne half the time. That's how complex Dedenne is. And in my own very simplified simulation of Dedenne, I also tried to do something like that. I tried to account for Dedenne triggering once before every meal and try to give you an average value if Dedenne triggers once every meal. But let's put all of that aside for a moment and rethink the situation. While we're not going to use this table highlights something very important. What we do know is that as you trigger Dedenne more and more, its value tapers. For example, you triggering Dedenne one time at level 6 skill level will give you a 10% boost to the entire week of dishes. But you taking 6 times the time to trigger it 6 times per day, you're only getting a 33% increase, which is not 6 times the first trigger. So you can see the value tapers rapidly, and we're going to use this to our advantage because now we're going to ask a different question. Since we kind of know that Dedenne is maximum value if you trigger it just the one time, no matter the skill level, and then you put it back into your Pokebox until a crit happens, then you bring it out again so that it's always just on the first trigger. What is the value of a single Dedenne trigger applied to the week? So let's go through that again. I've got another spreadsheet here. It looks scary, but just let me explain it all first. You don't need this table. You need the table I showed you at the start, and I'll summarize that towards the end. But let's see how I got to those numbers first. First thing is, for simplicity, let's just ignore the 30% boost of Sunday and the 3 times bonus. Look, I know it's amazing value. You can often level up your dish by using the Sunday, but Sunday already has a base crit that is higher than usual. But unfortunately, including Sunday into the calculations means that we're way overvaluing Dedenne because we're taking Sunday value and pretending that some of it applies to Monday. So we're going to ignore that. The premise is that we need our strength at the start of the week as early as possible so that for the rest of the week, we get high-powered sessions. That is the goal, not just Sunday sessions. But also it simplifies the calculations a lot more so that it's actually humanly possible to, without a Monte Carlo simulation, to calculate some sort of value. Let's look at the most simple scenario. If a dish has a 10% chance to crit, which is normally the case, I'm going to leave 0.1 here as the probability of critting. We haven't yet triggered Tasty Chance S. The multiplier if it crits is 2 times because that's the extra strength you get if you crit, and multiplier if no crit, that's just the normal dish strength, so 1 times. If this is the last meal of the week, so the meals remaining is 1, you only have 1 dish left to cook, then the base strength per meal is 1.1 times the regular dish strength. You should at least understand this part, because 9 out of 10 times the dish won't crit, so then it's only worth 1 times the value. 1 out of 10 times is worth 2 times the value. So if you sum up the expected value, it's 1.1 times. Hopefully you understand up to this point. That's not even Tasty Chance S. That is just the regular dish crit chance converted to an expected value. Now, if Tasty Chance triggers 1 time and gives us a 10% extra crit, that is a main skill level 6 Dedenne. We're gonna plug in here 0.1, that's an extra 10% chance to crit. So then the expected value goes up because we now have 20% chance to crit. Now, 8 out of 10 times we're gonna get 1 times the value, and 2 out of 10 times we're gonna get 2 times the value. So 0.8 plus 0.4 is 1.2. Hopefully you're still with me. That's again just how you calculate regular expected value. There's nothing too special here because the rest of it will get easier. No, it doesn't. But just bear with me because we're going to get to the end that will give you a simple table to use as sort of your calculator from now on. That means that by triggering Dedenne 1 time, 1.2 minus 1.1, we are getting a 0.1, or in other words, 10% more strength than our normal scenario when we have just 1 dish to cook. Hopefully that makes sense. So in other words, you trigger Dedenne once, there's only 1 meal remaining in the week, it's just giving you 10% more dish strength. Now comes the tricky part. When there are 2 meals left in the week, with each meal, of course, if Dedenne didn't trigger, the base strength per meal is still just 1.1 times for each meal because of the base crit rate. But for the same trigger of Dedenne, now we're not triggering a second time at all. In fact, we're just triggering Dedenne just the 1 time at the start and then not using Dedenne at all. What is the value if there are 2 meals remaining in the week? Let me say that again. The more meals you have left in the week, the greater the value of Dedenne. Hopefully you understand that, because when Dedenne doesn't crit, it brings the crit value to the next meal. So in terms of numerical value, 2 out of 10 times Dedenne has critted. In other words, by the second meal, there will be no crit value. There would just be the base crit value. But 8 out of 10 times Dedenne didn't crit, then that extra 10% of Tasty Chance S gets carried over to the second meal. The second meal now has a 20% chance of getting 2 times the value, which means for the second meal, there's an 80% chance that it will have an expected value of 1.2 and a 20% chance that it will have an expected value of 1.1. The 20% is because the previous meal already took that crit chance away, so then we're just down to the base crit value 20% of the time at the second meal. I'm sure I lost a lot of you already. Please just bear with me. We're going to get to a table that you can use without knowing any of this. I just want to show you how this is done, because even getting a glimpse of how this is done makes you understand how Dedenne works. Because if there are 2 meals remaining, the second meal by itself is better than just base crit rate by 8% if you have Dedenne trigger 1 time. But of course, we have to sum both the improvement on the first dish and the improvement of the second dish. This is the cumulative sum of these 2 numbers. This is the sum of both dishes 1 and 2. So this is the main number we need to look at. The cumulative improvement compared to base crit. Cumulative based on how many dishes remain in the week. And now, if we have a third dish remaining because let's say your Dedenne didn't crit the first 2 times, well, it continues to carry that value into subsequent dishes. And I pretty much just kept doing this number recurringly until we hit 21 dishes. Now remember, the second last row is the main number we're looking at. And you can see that by about dish 8, 9, 10, it's starting to taper off until dish 21. So in other words, if you cook Monday morning, so we're actually looking at this number from the end here, 21 dishes that remain in the week. So you haven't cooked anything at all. You have all 21 dishes yet to be cooked. If you simply trigger Dedenne just the 1 time, it's valued at nearly 50% extra strength of your dish. Now this is the value applied to a single dish by 1 single trigger. It is not the same as the numbers we saw earlier, these ones is the total dish strength throughout the week if you have Dedenne running 24/7, and it triggers a certain amount of times per day. Because it's so complex, I'm going to say that again. If there are 21 meals remaining in the week, your Dedenne's 1 level 6 trigger, so 10% crit rate, is expected to give you on average 50% more dish strength. If you're cooking a strong dish that is like 50,000 in strength, a single Dedenne trigger is 25,000 strength. That's really high. Heck, it's even higher than level 7 charge strength M for a single trigger. So Dedenne is the strongest of all skill specialists if we only ever trigger it once at the start of the week. Because the moment you start adding more Dedenne triggers, it tapers off how good Dedenne is. And don't forget, the other requirement is that you are cooking strong dishes. If you're cooking some mixed dish that only has 5,000 strength, well then charge strength M is better. And the other catch is you have to have enough ingredients and enough pot size to utilize Dedenne so that you can cook strong dishes. So there's a lot of requirements to make Dedenne good, but for a single trigger, ignoring all other factors in terms of needing resources and other Pokemon to help it get stronger, Dedenne's single trigger is super strong. It isn't super strong if this is the last meal of the week. Of course, Sunday has the extra crit rate and the extra bonus and the 3 times dish value. We're going to ignore that for a moment just to simplify the situation, but we're looking at a 10% boost if there's only 1 meal left. And if the dish is 50,000 in strength, well then 10% is just 5,000 strength, which isn't very much compared to the 50% that we saw. But again, it's not like every time you trigger Dedenne, you get an additional 50,000 in strength. That is not how it works. If we now add a second Dedenne trigger, so make this 0.2, and I've done these numbers ahead of time in preparation for this video. So this is a 20% Dedenne trigger. If there's only 1 meal remaining in the week, again, that's just an expected value of 1.3 minus the original crit rate. Base strength, which is 1.1, gives us a difference of 20% extra strength. And we can repeat this process by going to the end. If you trigger Dedenne twice at the start of the week, when there are 21 meals remaining, Dedenne provides you with a 66% extra strength on a single dish. Once again, for only 2 triggers, 66% is huge. But it's tapering now. Remember, our first trigger already gave us 50% extra strength. Our second trigger is only giving us an additional about 16% extra strength. That's not very much. Or per trigger, and this is what the final row is about, is I divide this number by the number of triggers used. Each trigger is only worth 33% because it takes time to trigger. You can't just think of Dedenne as though it can have infinite triggers at the start of the week. So the most value you can get out of Dedenne is only triggering it once at the start of the week. But there is a second trick to this. If a crit should happen, well, you can bring Dedenne back out again. And yes, there are less meals in the week, but you can still get a significant value with less meals remaining. Then I kept repeating this process, and you can see why it took me so long to make this video, because there were a lot of numbers involved and I had to think about whether Sunday should be included and do Sunday as well as a simulation. And my brain was fried because, again, I'm not a mathematician. It takes me a lot of time to think about these things. And coming down to a 70% Dedenne. In other words, if you could potentially trigger Dedenne 7 times before a meal is cooked. Let's come to 21 meals remaining. Dedenne provides you with an 87% improvement on a dish, but it took you 7 triggers to do this, so each trigger is only providing you with about 12% extra strength, which is not bad, but it's not like the first trigger when you could just trigger it once, put the Dedenne back into the box, start running other Pokemon to refill your ingredient bag or expand your pot or do healing, so do all this other stuff. After just 1 trigger, that is already providing you with a huge amount of strength. Now, what you might have noticed is that 87% extra strength doesn't seem to change very much. Well, yeah, because when you trigger Dedenne 7 times, you're almost guaranteed a crit on that first, second, or third meal. So most of the extra value comes earlier in terms of the number of meals remaining. By about 5 meals remaining in the week, we're already seeing the maximum value of Dedenne. Most of the value has already been put into the early meals. It's just going to crit earlier, so you don't see the value dragging onto the increased number of meals remaining. That's not an important point. I'm just explaining why the numbers taper off so quickly. It's just almost impossible for an 80% crit chance to not have already critted in the first 5 meals that you cook. Regardless, we're not going to be using Dedenne 7 times before every meal anyway. So now what I've done is I looked at this row here, which is the important number, and put them into one nice table so that you guys can just reference this quickly to see what kind of value you're expected to get out of one trigger of Dedenne. And we will start by looking at this table from the furthest column, because on Monday morning there are 21 meals remaining. By the way, I'll be posting the summary table into my Discord under Quick Guys if you need a reference. A single Dedenne trigger, if you have 21 meals left in the week, provides you with 50% extra strength. We already said that a few times, but this is the number I'm talking about. If you only have 1 meal remaining, then it only provides you, for the same trigger, only 10% extra strength. If you decide to trigger Dedenne multiple times, the extra strength that you get isn't much better. If you trigger Dedenne twice at the start of the week, before you cook any meal, you get 67% extra strength, which again is nice, but it's only an additional 17% for that second trigger. And then it continues to taper off, and between 6 and 7 triggers, only 1% extra value. So now if we want to look at the amount of strength per trigger needed, that's the second table. I simply took this number and divided by the number of triggers. And you can see it's greenness in the top right hand side corner. Because when it's 87% extra strength but took you 7 triggers, well, each trigger is only worth 13%, so not very much. So both tables have meaning to them. You'll be using the first table to calculate the value whenever you trigger Dedenne. But to understand the trend, it's the second table. Dedenne gives you the most value with the most number of meals remaining in the week and the least number of triggers before the meal is cooked. Of course, if you trigger more times, it will give you a higher value, which is the first table. It just took you longer to get those triggers when you might need it for healing, ingredients, expand pot, or whatever. And the second way to use this table is once the crit has happened, let's say by chance your first meal critted and you got really lucky, then run this table again. Trigger Dedenne one time, and now you have 20 meals remaining in the week. Well, Dedenne is going to give you 49% extra strength as opposed to 50. In fact, you can keep cycling this method, and almost every time in the first half of the week, you're getting nearly 50% more dish value by using Dedenne. Every time you've critted, then you bring Dedenne back out. The serious tapering comes down to when there's only about 6 or 3 meals left in the week, and then you bring out Dedenne to trigger, then you're starting to get 37%, 30%, 18%, maybe even 10% extra strength only. Now, I've double checked and triple checked all of my numbers as much as I can. I don't think there's any errors, but because I was working with so many numbers, my brain got fried. You just let me know if I made any mistake. I'll correct them in the subsequent post under Quick Guys in my Discord. Now, for those of you who are seriously math inclined, I have done some sort of simulation for Sunday crit as well. You can't just plug these numbers into the original table. The original table has to ignore Sunday crit, otherwise it's just way too complex. But let's look at Sunday crit as well. And this is a quick one because there's only 3 meals possible to have Sunday's value. So the Sunday base crit rate is 0.3, so in other words 30% chance to trigger, but if it triggers you get 3 times the value. So 3 out of 10 times you get 3 times the value, plus 7 out of 10 times you get 1 times the value. In total you're looking at a 1.6 times extra value just by having base crit without Dedenne. What's interesting is if you now add Dedenne, which is a 10% crit. For 10% crit, you're expected to get 20% more crit value, which is a 20% improvement compared to our base crit rate. So a single Dedenne trigger is even more value because of the better crit multiplier. If there are 3 meals remaining, we're looking at 39% extra strength if you trigger Dedenne just the one time before a Sunday meal is cooked. The question you gotta ask yourself is, yes, this sounds really good, but does it matter to you when you can only use that strength or that drowsy power for 1 or 2 sessions remaining in the week? Or perhaps you're using this value in order to raise your dish level. Let me know if you have any questions down below in the comment section. Any questions you ask may take me a few extra spreadsheets just to answer them. But I hope you enjoyed this table because this has changed the game on how we can finally value Dedenne. Thank you for watching, guys. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And know that every time I make such a complex video, it takes time away from making other content. So if you want to see more of this type of video, just smash that like button.